Hello and welcome to the second of the recorded narrations for PowerPoint presentations for nr323 for the spring 2020 semester. We've been working on lecture 6, which is a multi-part lecture that has to do with digital image processing. In particular, we are now at the point where we can study classification, okay? And classification is probably the most often application of remote sensing type of application. That is, we're taking the spectral information that's been recorded by a sensor and translating that information into thematic classes. So for instance, this is a very popular classification, the National Land Cover Database, that's created using Landsat data for the United States at about 5-year intervals, and it's based on roughly 16 classes that the U.S. Geological Survey has been focused on for their mapping for decades. So simple, basic land cover designations like open water, ice, 4 levels of developed lands, barren lands, deciduous, evergreen, and mixed forests, dwarf, scrub, which is an Alaska only class, shrub scrub. So, when you're looking at things like sagebrush, that would be a shrub scrub, grassland and herbaceous, sedge and herbaceous, and lichens, also Alaska only, and moss. So those are, typically found in seasonally wet permafrost areas, and then cultivated areas, pasture, crops, and finally woody wetlands. So it was 16, and it looks like they added, for the most recent 4 classes that I never use because I don't work in Alaska. So here's an overview here to give you a sense of what goes on when we're doing a classification. Obviously, at the top, we're starting with imagery. But then a little bit further, I've got knowledge of the scene. And depending on what your knowledge of the scene is, there are 2 types of classification. So if on the right you have formal knowledge of what's going on in the scene, that is, for instance, you've got training sites, which is what we'll call them, areas that either on the ground or through photo interpretation of aerial photography, what is at a particular point. If you have that kind of information, you can do a supervised classification. Supervised classification, we'll see, just means that you're going to take that information and you're going to develop for each class that you've identified a different spectral signature. So average and variability of the spectral reflectance in however many bands you have for each land cover type. Now, if you don't have that kind of formal training data, then you might have some kind of formal or informal knowledge. That is, you might not have a sufficient number of plots to really give you everything that you need in terms of formal data required for a supervised classification, or you might only have informal knowledge. That is, you're familiar with a place, but you don't feel like you could put down a particular point and say with any high degree of certainty, this is what is located in this place. And in those cases, you tend to use something called an unsupervised classification. An unsupervised classification means that the computer is going to look for certain certain patterns of spectral response that lots of pixels have. So basically, to put it simply, you're going to try to find types of pixels that appear throughout an image in a regular fashion. Like, if you have lots of water in a particular image, then your unsupervised classification is going to say, oh, there's an awful lot of stuff that looks dark in all the bands. That must be some sort of unique land cover type, and we're going to label it as such. Now, formally, the unsupervised and supervised classification processes gives you a set of spectral signatures. So for instance, for water, you would have a spectral signature showing that, dark pixels are associated. So you might have an average for the 7 Landsat bands, and they would all be dark, low values for each one of the bands in that image. So then once you have spectral signatures, you can then use a classification rule. And we'll discuss 4 classification rules here. The 3 listed and another one that's become very popular in the last, say, 5 years, decision tree classification rule. Basically, once you know what the different kinds of pixels are and what their spectral signatures are, you look at individual pixels and say, which one of the spectral signatures I've identified does each pixel look like? And the rule that you use to determine what something looks like is the classification rule. When you're done with that, you then have a thematic image. So an image where every pixel has had a class assigned to it. And then critically, and we'll talk about this in the next lecture, critically, you have to do an accuracy assessment. The human eye-brain combination is very good at tricking itself into thinking that it's created a map that looks like your idea of what's out there in the real world. But in fact, it's very easy to trick yourself. And so you really need to have a quantitative accuracy assessment where you use a separate data source to check on the accuracy with which you assigned various classes to individual pixels. So, image classification, just using the spectral information represented by digital numbers, or whether those are radiance, or you could be using reflectance information depending on the image source you're using. And of course, you're probably using more than one spectral band to characterize each pixel's and assign a class to each pixel. Okay, so the objective is to assign all the pixels in the image to particular classes or themes. So classes or themes could be water, it could be coniferous forest, deciduous forest. You could be doing an agricultural classification, so the classes might be corn or wheat. And then the resulting classified image is a mosaic of pixels, each of which belongs to a particular theme. And so you then have a thematic map of the original image. So conceptually, here's an image. You're starting with the original, in general, multispectral image data. You're developing a statistical description of what the relationship is between those spectral values and some classes that, in this case, have been assigned using an unsupervised classification. So that space there is just, as usually, I plot brightness values in TM band 3 versus brightness values in TM band 4. Each one of those circles is a class. And so what you're saying essentially is if you have pixels that fall, whose values fall within those circles, then it belongs to a particular class. When we get to classification rules, we'll discuss what we do when pixels don't fall within any particular one of those circles. And then once you've identified the class associated with those brightness values, you assign that and create a thematic map. Now, before we continue, we need to discuss a distinction that underlies the rest of the discussion, and that is spectral or information classes. So when we talk about classes, we have information classes, things like land cover. These are the thematic classes you use, and spectral classes, and those are groups of pixels that are spectrally uniform or almost uniform. So information classes are the categories of interest that the analyst is trying to identify in the imagery. For instance, it could be different kinds of crops, different forest types, tree species. It could be different geologic units or rock types or water or beach, or this is the classes that we are interested in. Spectral classes are just groups of pixels that are uniform or near uniform with respect to their brightness values in the different spectral channels of the data. So if you looked around an image, you might see that all forests on south-facing slopes are very similar in appearance. And therefore, if you plotted out spectral values within, say, that band 3, band 4 graph or space that we were just looking at, all those pixels would fall within a relatively small area. And so that would be a spectral class, okay? And the objective in classification is, in some sense, matching the spectral classes in the data with the information classes of interest, because those spectral classes, they have a sort of mathematical reality in the data. All of the similar pixels you can define using a mathematical rule. You could say plus or minus 5% of a particular reference reflectance value. Those would all be belonging to a spectral class. The information classes, as we'll see, have a more complicated relationship to what's going on in the image. There's rarely a simple one-to-one match between these two types of classes. So you may have unique spectral classes that don't actually correspond to any information class of particular use or interest to the analyst. So for instance, you might have a subset of crops that are on, well, like for instance, I've been working in Puerto Rico a lot. They have karst topography. That is, it's topography that has been formed on limestone beds, okay? And so you get very rolling topography. You get a lot of sinkholes. A sinkhole with a forest in it might be a particular spectral type, but you may have no interest in that particular spectral type. You might want to be classifying forests more generally, okay? Alternatively, you can have a broad information class, so forests, that may contain a number of spectral subclasses with unique spectral variations. Okay, and so part of the analyst's job is to decide on what to do with the different spectral classes and how they correspond to the useful information classes that you're trying to derive. So very often when we're doing land cover mapping, we're going to want to aggregate different spectral classes and assign them to information classes. So this is especially the case in when you're using unsupervised methods, because unsupervised methods are just going to give you uniform or near uniform spectral classes, but you might come up with two spectral classes like north-facing and south-facing forest, or north-facing and south-facing crops for that matter, that need to be aggregated in order to create the information class you're interested in, which would be forest or crop. And then this is a relatively simple procedure. You can just take those individual subclasses that you've come up with, so a north-facing, a south-facing crop situation, and just recode them in a GIS operation to a single crop type. So here's an example where that works. You have a single information class, forest. Then you might have spectral subclasses arising from variation in illumination, so shadowed or directly lit. You might have spectral subclasses that arise from variation in species composition, so one dominated by a broadleaf forest, or one where you have a pretty even mix of needleleaf and broadleaf forests. And then you might have subclasses that arise from variations in density. So you might have some areas that are sparse forest, some areas that are dense forest. That's the simple situation, because we can just take each one of these classes and recode it to a single output information class. So even if you'd wound up with, say, 6 classes or spectral subclasses of information of the single information class forest, you could just go through and use a GIS recode operation to get a single output class forest. The more difficult situation is where you have one spectral class and many information classes. So for instance, over here on the left, this is a little subset of Fort Collins. We've got these two, bright red, you can probably guess this is a color infrared image. This is a bright red area, and in 2 different patches. And then actually looking at a national land cover data set for the same area, we find that they've been classified in 2 different ways. The brown patch there is pasture. The yellow patch is grassland. So what we see here is that we have 2 very similar spectral conditions associated with 2 different information classes. And that's where we get into trouble, because then in our classification, we have to try to find ways to develop rules of one sort or another to separate out the 2 classes. So now we've gone through the types of classes. We can now start talking about unsupervised classification. So unsupervised classification is just identifying sort of natural groups of similarly, spectrally similar pixels, or we sometimes think of this as structures in multispectral data. So for instance, if you were looking at the distribution of points or pixels within a graph, again, band 3 versus band 4, you might see structures, you might see places, and you will see places as we move along with this, where there's a whole bunch of points. So that's how we think about it, as sort of a little structure within the data set. And in general, it can be demonstrated that remotely sensed images are composed of spectral classes that internally are relatively uniform with respect to brightness in several spectral classes. I mean, you generally don't have, for instance, you have fields of corn, fields of wheat, fields of soybeans. You hardly ever see a field that has a mix of all three species, right? So just because the world is organized that way, images are organized the same way. They generally tend to have different spectral classes that are uniform with respect to each one of them and then distinct from other spectral classes. And unsupervised classification is just the process of identifying, labeling, and then mapping those classes. So unsupervised classifications are going to be more or less simple algorithms that don't require a lot of input information or a lot of tweaking as they run, okay? And they're just going to go pixel by pixel and identify clusters or groupings of data within what we'll refer to as feature space. So assuming there are clusters apparent in the image data, this is done by calculating the distances between specific pixels within this feature space and assigning them to cluster centers. The technique that I prefer is ISO-data, the iterative self-organizing data analysis technique. It only requires a few parameters. For instance, in the program erdos, it only requires that you tell it how many classes you want, and a rule about how many pixels must remain unchanged between iterations. So this is, as it says, an iterative technique. It's going to look at the data multiple times. And when each subsequent look is going to change the assignment of pixels to clusters or classes. When the amount of change falls below a given threshold, and the default is 95%. If 95% of the pixels don't change class, then that's the point at which the clustering process will stop. Or if the number of iterations, the number of looks at the data exceeds a given number that you give it, then it will also stop. So you have to tell it how many classes you want. You have to tell it what percentage of pixels can remain constant to force the iterations to stop. And then you need an alternate criteria for that stopping, the number of iterations. So now we'll talk about feature spaces. The way we've talked about spectral qualities so far has largely been using the idea of a spectral signature. That is, here we have three different surface types: soils, vegetation, and water. And we have the sort of continuous spectral signature, what the reflectance is as a function of wavelength. And then we have two bands there, band 1 and band 2. And we're going to figure out how bright the reflectance is in each of those bands. And that's what the sensor is going to do, right? It's going to come up with a number that tells us how bright or how reflective a particular pixel is for a given wavelength, wavelengths 1 and 2. So that's the sort of spectral space. On the right is the feature space. And in the feature space, we're once again plotting one band against the other. So wavelength 1 band and wavelength 2 band. And again, this is essentially you're looking at bands 3 and 4 from Landsat, red and near infrared. And so whereas water has low values for both wavelength 1 and wavelength 2, we can see that in the spectral space. But then in feature space, that just means that that water pixel is going to be near the origin. Going back to the spectral space, we have sort of a higher value for soil in band 1 and a moderate value for band 2. So what we're going to find is, soil is going to have a high brightness along the band 1 axis and a moderate value along band 2 axis, and supporting the idea that this is a red near infrared space. Vegetation has low values or a low value for wavelength 1 and a very high value for wavelength 2. And so it's plotted, sort of a little darker, it's shown, than soil in the feature space, but much higher in terms of wavelength 2. So this is the two complementary ways of looking at the spectral qualities of particular pixels, or these could be averages for a given class. They can represent different things. In this case, we're going to talk about them or think about them as individual pixels. The way we use this feature space is we're going to say points that are closer in feature space are more similar. That makes sense, right? I mean, it makes sense in either space. In the spectral space, if you had two lines that, almost overlapped, then you would say, oh, those two things are similar. Well, in the feature space, that's all translated to where you are, what your position is. And then if we have a unknown pixel, right? So here we have this peach colored pixel. We don't know what it is. We can look at the distance between that pixel and known pixels, right? So that you can say, well, this pixel is closest to vegetation, for instance. I think actually it's pretty much equidistant. And therefore, I'm going to call that pixel vegetation. At the simplest level, this is the role of classification rules, is taking unknown pixels and comparing them to known pixels and assigning them a class. And, we usually look at these things in 2 dimensions, but we can look at them in 3 dimensions as well. So doesn't matter what kind of image it is, band 4, band 5, band 6, and we have 4 classes. Each one is denoted with a letter. It's W, A, O, or M. And you can see that in this case, we're displaying the fact that there's variability, right? Because no 2 pixels, some pairs of pixels will be identical, but if you look in a forest, we keep using this phrase like near uniform. Not every pixel in a forest is going to have exactly the same spectral quality. It's going to depend on species composition, density, slope, aspect, all the things we talked about. So there's going to be some variability, and whereas in the last image, we didn't look at that variability, here we're sort of not only looking in 3 dimensions, but also showing you the variability. So now we have the tools in hand to start thinking about how we're going to do an unsupervised classification. And the first step in the ISO data process is we need to come up with a series of guesses about where the original class locations should be put. That is, let's say in this case, we're going to have 5 classes for our unsupervised classification. Because those classes will be defined ultimately by where they're located within feature space, we need to have a preliminary guess at where those classes would be. And the easiest thing to guess is to simply say, well, they're going to be evenly spread within the feature space relative to the mean and standard deviation of each spectral band. So here we're looking at band 3 versus band 4. Again, we'll just assume it's Landsat. And this little hat-like shape, if this reminds you of the tassel cap, this is not a mistake. This is the projection of a tassel cap into band 3 and band 4. Let's say that line, that shaded polygon, that's where 95% of the points are. We're not going to draw the points because that's, it would just make a mess out of it. So that's where the individual pixels are located. 95% of them are within that little hat looking object. Now we're going to add to that a guess about where the clusters actually are within that space. And we're just going to take the mean. You can see on each axis, you've got the normal distribution with a mean and plus or minus 1 standard deviation. So 66% of the data will be included within plus or minus 1 standard deviation. And we're just going to lay out points evenly between -1 and +1 standard deviation from the mean. And we're going to do that for each one of the bands. So you can imagine that you had a table, and in the on the top of the table you'd have bands 1 through whatever n, and on the x-axis you would have, the y-axis, the rows of the table, you would have class 1, class 2, class 3, and you would fill in, for class 1, the band for the value for band 1 for class 1 would be -1 standard deviation below the mean value for band 1, and it would be the same for band 2, 3, 4, 5. They're all going to be at the lowest end of the distribution for each of the bands. And band 2 would be that next one, and it would also have that next higher value for each one of the bands. So in this case, it's half a standard deviation below the mean for bands 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. All the way up to +1 standard deviation. So in the first step, we're going to look at all the pixels that are within that within the image, and we're going to ask the question, which cluster mean position is it closest to? Okay, we're going to assign every pixel that's closest to a particular mean position to the cluster that has that mean position. Okay, so at this point, all we've done is assign those pixels. So the ones all the way out at the tails of the distribution, the sort of the pointy bits at the three edges of the hat, are going to be assigned to whatever pixel whatever cluster they are closest to, even though they're quite far away. Because the rule is every pixel has to be associated with one cluster. We're then going to recalculate the average position of each cluster. And so, in particular, clusters that are near one of those three edges or 3 points are going to be moved toward the extreme portion of that distribution. Because now you have a whole bunch of pixels with very low values for the first cluster, or very high values for the last cluster, that are going to be taken into account for the average of that particular cluster. And in addition to showing these clusters, we can now talk about these ovals. And those ovals just show the 95% confidence intervals for that mean value, okay? And there's some overlapping, okay? Because it's so highly variable, there are going to be some areas where pixels could just mathematically be assigned to one or the other cluster. And this is why, as we go forward, pixels are going to move back and forth between two clusters. So, once we've calculated new cluster means for each one of the clusters, we're going to do the same process. We're going to look at all the pixels and then say, oh, well, now which cluster does that particular pixel belong to? Because the cluster mean may have moved far away from or further away from a particular pixel. So now another cluster mean might be closer, okay? And so the process begins again of reassigning pixels, recalculating cluster means, and then doing a check to see what percentage of pixels have changed class. And once you get to the point where you've met your criteria for the fraction of pixels that are not changing, or we run out of iterations that we've specified, we're just going to keep doing this, okay? And as you can see, as you get, at least in this sort of imaginary space, this cartoon version of how the algorithm works, you now have classes that are very much associated with the three extremes of the distribution. The one that's got low values for band 3 and band 4, the one that's got high values for band 3 and band 4, and then that circular one up there that has moderate values for band 3 but high values for band 4. And this is an example of what you would get if you started not with 5 classes, but 20 classes. And again, there's the distribution of brightness values. Say the 95% of all the pixels fall within that brown or grayish polygon. And here we've set up a series of initial guesses for the position and variability of each of the classes. Then after 20 iterations, this is, at least in the cartoon version, what you get is individual clusters have moved in the direction of such that they are overlapping with most of the places where you have pixels associated with the image conditions, right? So like 20 has moved out to take over that one lobe that was in the data. 18 has moved out. Otherwise, you see they're mostly just clumped in the middle. Now, these are two standard deviation intervals for those ovals. So there are some places where there just aren't a lot of pixels that don't have a class associated with them. So for instance, that area of gray space between 18 and 20, if you look at all the gray space, that should be about 5% of the data is hanging out in those areas, and they just haven't affected the individual cluster means or cluster standard deviations enough to pull a class over to cover that particular area. Okay, that's the theory, and that's the set of images that are used 99% of the time to show the concept of ISO data. What I did was to look at our usual TM3432C, okay, just take a subset of that, and did successive ISO data runs with greater numbers of iterations, okay? So I started out with, I just ran it once and recorded the positions of the cluster means, and then I did it twice and recorded those positions. And so you can actually see, using this data set, how the cluster means changes as a function of iteration. And so in the next couple of images, I plot a white line to show the trajectory of each of 8 classes that I use for ISO data. And then at the point where they end, I put in a black diamond, so you know that's where their final position was. And I then also put in an ellipse, which, depending on which one you're looking at, is either 1 or 2 standard deviations to show you the variability of the final class. So here we have near infrared and red, so bands 4 and 3. We have the white line, so if you look at, say, class 8 in the upper right, you can see where class 8 was originally located based on just the guess of the computer, and where it moved over the course of the iterations that it went through until it finally winds up at that black diamond. And then the circle shows you 2 standard deviations. I'm sorry, 1 standard deviation for the pixels associated with that particular cluster. And so you can imagine, even though you don't have the larger number of standard deviations, that that cluster includes all the areas to the right and up from there, all those, relatively infrequent points. In case you don't remember, areas in this image where you have red means there are a lot of points in the images. Areas where you have green or cyan or blue or purple, those are areas where there are not a lot of pixels. So cluster 8 the mean is not very far out toward that northeast. You can think of it as northeast, or you can think of it as upper right, because there just aren't a lot of pixels there. The average position is still within that area where that's yellow. So you can see 8 moves quite a bit, and you can see 5 moves quite a bit, and you can't see the label, but 1 moves quite a bit, the one down near the lower left hand corner. But not a whole heck of a lot happens with the intermediate numbered clusters. So this is 2, 3, 4. They move, but in fact, in some cases, they move one way and then they move another way, and don't necessarily wind up. Class 2 essentially doesn't move at all. You can't see a white line there. It's all covered by black diamond. But there's some interesting things that go on with clusters 4, 6, and 7, and they do move to fill in an area. For instance, cluster 6, I hope you can see that right there. It's the one that's well, in the lower right-hand corner, you can see the last little bit there of cluster 5, and then right above that is where cluster 6 is. And you can see as cluster 5 gets moved out to take the position of high near infrared, low red, cluster 6 kind of gets dragged along with it in order to as points closer to the center point of cluster 6 become further and further away from the center point of cluster 5. Then this is band 4 versus 3 thematic. So this shows you which class winds up in which or which cluster each pixel is associated with. In particular, what's interesting is if you look at that first cluster down there at the lower left, you have the mean position of the that cluster has very little to do with, and if you go back one slide, if you can do that, you can see that down right near the origin, there's a whole bunch of points that are water points. And those are classified as class 1, but in fact, the mean class 1 position has nothing to do with water itself. So in this case, your thought as a remote sensing scientist would be, well, I just didn't put in enough clusters. Now, you can see that we have mixes. It's not a clean, there's no clean boundaries between each one of the color-coded classes. And that's just because we're only looking at it in 2 dimensions. Some pixels in some of these subsetted areas where there are mixed pixels would be closer to one or the other class in some other band or set of bands. So there's no clean boundaries. If we had just used band 4 and band 3 as the class for this classification, there would be clear boundaries. But that would have been not making good use of our data. And so this is what the classification winds up looking like. Band 1 purple, that's mostly water. It is also, though, dark forest. And you will find that this is a problem in any place where you've got the combination of well-developed forests and rugged topography, that your north-facing forests, so forests on north-facing slopes, will be very dark. Not as dark as water, but fundamentally, as you've been able to see with the unsupervised classification, the forest is quite similar looking to water in the overall context of looking at all the pixels, okay? Which is what the unsupervised classification is doing. It's saying, well, we've got a whole bunch of pixels. All of them need to be represented to some extent. And within that context, these 2 land cover types are essentially identical as far as the algorithm is concerned. So we already talked about this, how many classes are enough? Clearly, the number of classes I used for this little example weren't enough because the water did not come up as a distinct class. It's actually, in these kinds of cases, very difficult to get water to come up as a distinct class. But, if you have too few, and we probably have too few here, you're going to have numerous cover types, real cover types in the real world that are going to share a particular spectral class. I should say that very often when you do get this mix between water and shaded forest, heavy shaded forest, the thing to do is to take all the pixels that belong to those 2 classes and do an unsupervised classification just on those 2 classes. So mask everything else out. Because if you do that, in that context, the distinction between the two classes becomes quite obvious mathematically. So we've seen the case where there are too few. If you have too many, you're going to wind up with redundant classes. So you might wind up with 4 kinds of water, which is okay sort of in theory. In practice, if you wind up with creating 70 classes and you wind up wanting to recode them to say 12 classes, it's just a lot of manual labor that you have to do to, convince ArcGIS that it wants to do recoding with that many classes. So either way, you're probably going to need to break up some classes or combine classes before you have a final product that you're comfortable with. The way that identifying each class, what that workflow looks like, you start with, in the upper left-hand corner, your original image. You set up your unsupervised classification and tell it the number of classes you want and what the stopping rules should be. And then you get basically just a black and white image in general, where each level of gray is just the average brightness of a particular class, but the data in the image itself is class data, which if you do what's referred to as a color slice, you do this in ArcGIS, right, in the symbology plane, and you assign a different color to each one of the values associated with the unsupervised classification. You see now you can see all the different classes. Again, that's not spectral information. Those are just colors that have been assigned to thematic classes. The next step, you'd make everything a neutral color, white or gray, and change each one of the classes in turn. So in this case, I've made all the colors white, and then I went back and made class 8 green. And just looking at the original image, using that informal knowledge that I have about the scene, I can tell, oh, well, those are green agricultural fields. And so for some purposes, that may be enough. Particularly if, for instance, if all you need to know is, a rough estimate of how much agriculture there is in this small image subset, you might be able to go in and say, okay, well, I've looked at all these classes, 1 or 2 of them are clearly agricultural, and now I'm just going to sum up those values. To have a better notion of what your accuracy is for more detailed purposes, you're going to have to do an accuracy assessment, and we'll talk about that in the next lecture. And this is your final product. You basically just go in and assign class names. You can see that on the right-hand side of that table, and you assign meaningful colors, and that gives you your unsupervised classification. Now, the unsupervised classification, even though it's giving us the image in one step, fundamentally what it's done is assigned average and standard deviation or variability of the reflectance or digital numbers for each one of those classes that we've now identified using the identification procedures. Okay, so that gets us back to the spectral signature for each one of those classes. Advantages of unsupervised classification: there's no extensive prior knowledge of the region that's required. You know, knowing as much as you know about Fort Collins and the area around it now, you ought to be able to look at an unsupervised classification and assign labels to each one of the classes. You know, oh, well, that's Horsetooth, so, and it's class 7, so class 7 must be water. And then, you know, you do a little due diligence to make sure everything that you've called class 7 is actually water. Then you can move on to your next one. Sometimes it's going to be more confusing like that, you know, particularly when you have questions like pasture or rangeland. But you know, in general, you probably have a pretty good sense for what the majority of the classes are and where they are in this area. And if not, you know, get out, travel around a little bit. Or, that's a joke, you know, you could use aerial photography. For instance, you could use NAPP or NAIP data and figure out what you're actually looking at and say, oh, well, look, I see, you know, there are cows being grazed land there, so that's a pasture area. So you don't need a lot of prior knowledge of the region. The opportunity for human error is minimized. What we're going to see with supervised classification is that the biggest source of error you're going to have is just your ability to identify good training samples for the supervised classification. And in general, if you have something unique that you might not have considered, like, you know, for instance, what's a good one? Well, like particular roof types, for instance. If you had like a lot of red clay Spanish tile roofs and you didn't necessarily think about that before you started the classification, unsupervised classification is going to pick out that unique spectral condition and assign it a class. Disadvantages are, you know, unsupervised classification are rely on natural groupings or clusters, and matching them with what's actually going on in the real world is not necessarily the easiest thing to do. So spectral classes are not necessarily information classes, okay? You have very little control over the image classes, okay? So for instance, again, well, let's see, I'll do, if we're doing mixed forest, conifer forest, and broadleaf forest, the unsupervised classification may always determine those as a single class, or it might just split it into two classes. And basically the only way you can get finer control over that is by increasing the number of classes that you're using. And so that makes it very difficult to come up with classes that you can rely on the definition. There's always a certain fuzziness about it. And once you have an unsupervised classification, it's only applicable to the data you've used it from, okay? Spectral properties are going to change over time. You're not going to be able to take the information from an unsupervised classification and apply it to another scene necessarily. Okay, so we've gone through unsupervised classification. We're now going to go through supervised classification. So supervised classification, it requires some supervision, right? You need to be specifying to the whatever algorithm you use a numerical description of various land cover types present in a given scene. So that means you first have to determine what classes you're going to need to use, and then you're going to need to collect information in the form of training samples that you can use to define the spectral characteristics of each one of those classes. So there are three main stages. The first is creating the classification scheme and collecting the training data. That's the training stage. Doing the classification itself, which takes the spectral information that you've collected and applies that to actually classify the individual pixels. And then accuracy assessment, which we will talk about next, but I stress it over and over again because, again, without an accuracy assessment, a formal accuracy assessment, you really are on not very solid ground in using the output of a classification. So in the training stage, the operator, you are going to identify representative training areas with a scene, okay, and develop a numerical description of the spectral attributes of each of the land cover types you're interested in. And again, you need to define which ones you're interested in. And that's going to be totally dependent on what your objective is. Ultimately, the accuracy you're going to get is determined during this training stage, okay? And that's what's going to determine the success or failure. And as I mentioned before, just the mechanics of collecting the training data sets that brings in the potential for human error. So for instance, you're going to be digitizing polygons around areas that you think are a particular cover type and that have a particular uniform spectral quality. But you will undoubtedly, in some cases, screw that up. And you will, for instance, digitize over a road. So now you have an example of, say, a forest class, but it's got a concrete road, but it's much brighter, therefore, than other forests. And so you've made the forest class highly variable by adding in that particular training site. So those are the kind of human error situations that lead to bad supervised classifications. And in general, you'll probably, in the lab, do a bad supervised classification because it's your first time. First time I did a supervised classification, it came out badly. It's just there are too many things to juggle all at the same time to really be able to do it well the first time. We have this concept that in order to get acceptable results, your training data has to be representative and complete. And by representative and complete, they seem in some ways like contrary goals. So representative means you should have examples of say forests that are representative of what most forests look like in the scene. So for instance, when you're creating training data sets, you don't want to have every kind of forest. So for instance, you might not want to have, forests that have beetle kill in them because that's not a typical forest. And we're going to be creating these statistical descriptions of what a forest looks like spectrally. And if we start throwing in a lot of examples of unusual types of forest, we're going to wind up with a class that basically could look like anything in the image. But there is also a need for completeness. So For instance, if you're dealing with crops and you have corn and soybean and oats in the image, then you better include soil, oats, and corn as separate classes, or at least spectral subclasses of a crop type, an overall crop type. So it's a balancing act is what I'm trying to get at. Again, there are a number of approaches to collecting, training data to give you spectral signatures, but they all rely to a certain degree on the experience of the analyst. And so, very often I'll be looking over the shoulder of someone doing a supervised classification, and we'll see that particular areas are being misclassified, and we'll focus in on those areas that appear to be having some problems with classification. Sometimes you have to put in pairs of points, one of them, say, in a forest that looks like a shrub area, and in a shrub area that looks like forest, so that you can define where that boundary is. Again, it all comes down to having experience with this kind of analysis. This is what a training data set looks like. So this is from Morro Bay in California. And what they've done is they have put down a series of polygons. Fundamentally, that's what training data sites are. You're putting in polygons around areas that you're certain, either because you've been there or because you are looking at other data like photo data that tells you that that's a particular class, and giving a label to that particular area so that the computer can then go in and calculate average spectral qualities for each one of the classes. So that's what will be, as far as the computer is concerned, the output of the training data stage. A series of average, and it's not shown here, but also standard deviations of the either digital numbers or reflectances in your image as a function of band and as a function of your differing land cover types. So in this case, we have a series of water and sediment types, all of which are relatively dark. And then it's hard to see, but there's one class there, surf, which is much brighter than any of the other classes. And so you would imagine that it'd be easy to separate out the surf areas from any of these other areas, much easier than it would be to separate out, say, one of the sediment values or sediment classes. So now we're looking back in feature space, and this is a data set that I made from, again, National Land Cover data set and an image I had. So I used the National Land Cover data set to generate training data to use within, this is ERDOS, similar visualization exists within ArcGIS, and it's showing you all of the classes that we're interested in there. There's 13 that we've got that we found within the scene of interest, and where they lay out and how they overlap. Note, these are quarter standard deviation ellipses. So we're looking at just where the very core pixels are. And you can see that they line up well with that grayscale two-dimensional histogram in the background. Generally we have ellipses in all the places where there are a lot of points. If we had used an unsupervised classification, then we would have a perfect relationship between the places where the ellipses are and where the most points are. But this is one of the things that you get into with supervised classification, is that your defined classes may not align perfectly with the actual spectral classes in the image itself. So here's just an example of a supervised and unsupervised comparison. This is for, gosh, I don't remember, but it's obviously an area that's got it's a desert scene, and it's got some darker geology, and then it looks like it's got some saline crust as well. So this is probably from Yuma, Arizona, which is a place where I've worked. Oh, sorry. We had the input data, image, and the polygons for supervised, and then for unsupervised, of course, we just have the image. Here's the supervised, and if you think back to the original image, or go back in time, then you can see that it does a pretty good job of picking up the various classes. Unsupervised, we used enough classes that actually it's picking up some nice variability within each one of the classes, but with some recoding, it would probably look a lot more like the supervised classification. And that's, of course, very often merging classes is part of that unsupervised classification approach. So advantages and disadvantages of supervised classification. Advantages: the analyst controls the selected menu of information classes or categories, and they can tailor them for a specific purpose and geographic region. You've tied your classes to specific areas of known identity rather than just statistical properties of the image as a whole. And you can evaluate results with additional training areas as you go along. The disadvantages are the analyst is imposing a classification structure on the data, and it may not match the natural spectral clusters that exist. The training data is defined based on information categories and not on spectral properties. So, for instance, there might be important variations in forests that you're not picking up using the classification scheme. Careful selection of training areas is time and labor intensive, which is why in the lab we don't aim on having a really good supervised classification for a large number of classes. We simplify it quite a bit. And training areas may not encompass or represent special or unique categories that don't fit into the information classes that you've generated in your head. So, and we saw that actually when we looked at the overlapping ellipses from the ERDOS figures, where I had looked at the various classes from the NLCD. The NLCD classes did not line up very well with where most of the points were in some places. And then to review unsupervised classification, advantages: no extensive prior knowledge of the region is required. The opportunity for those little digitation errors and similar things is minimized. Unique classes will be recognized as distinct units. And logistically, it's just less cumbersome to have to deal with, or to not have to deal with, the training data sets. The disadvantages: natural groupings do not necessarily correspond nicely with your information classes. You have no control over the menu of classes and what their identification would be. And the spectral properties of information classes vary over time and between scenes. And so it's difficult to impossible to reuse the results of an unsupervised classification. It's something that has to be done new for each new image. Whereas you do have some ability to take a supervised classification and train it from one image and then apply it to another image. Okay, so now we're down to pixel classification. This is something we've sort of ignored during our discussion. But once you have cluster means, whether it's been generated from unsupervised classification or supervised classification, you need to, you have the cluster means, which is the same as saying you have the spectral signatures. You need to have rules that allow you to take individual pixels and say, well, which class does a particular pixel look like? And there are various ways you can mathematize the question of what things look like, what's most similar. We'll talk about 4 actually. One of them is the minimum distance to mean. The next one is a parallelepiped classifier. We'll look at the maximum likelihood classifier, which until recently has been the most popular. And then we'll look at the decision tree analysis. So this is what we would have at the end of an unsupervised classification, right? Each one of those letters represents a particular class, and its location represents what its brightness or reflectance is in 2 bands, band 4 and band 3. So each one of those was generated by digitizing a small area on the image and calling it one of those classes, and then average spectral values were calculated for each one, and the little value, the class code, was plotted at the position implied by the mean spectral values. So the simplest way you can make rules about, or the simplest rule you can have about classifying a new point, and we've got 2 new points there. You should see point 1 and point 2, is to simply define the maximum and minimum spectral values in each wavelength band, right? So it's easy to see here because we have a 2 wavelength plot. You can use minimum or maximum values of the training data for that class to come up with that. Or you could use standard deviations. It's not commonly done, but it can be done. So plot the mean plus or minus either 1, 2, or 3 standard deviations. This is a non-parametric rule, meaning that it's not based on statistics, and therefore it's if you use min-max values, I should say, it's independent of the statistical properties of the data. Okay. The advantage is it's simple and it's fast, right? All you're doing is saying, okay, we're going to define everything within a particular box as urban or sand or hay or forest. And if, like with point 1, with point 2, it falls within the box of urban, then that's what it is. It's urban. If it falls within the box of hay, then as with point 1, then we're going to define it as hay. So it's simple, it's fast, it's often useful for a first pass broad classification just to see how you're doing. The disadvantages are it's not very accurate. If you look particularly at point 1, okay, it falls within the range of spectral qualities for hay, H, but it's not really very much like hay. It's near, the minimum value for band 4, but the maximum value for band 3. And so there's really no hay in that area that we've defined. Therefore, it's probably not hay. It's going to be an incorrect classification. It's much closer to looking like a C or corn, right? Even though it doesn't fall within those limits. You can also see that in some cases, these boxes overlap. So there's areas where corn and hay overlap. There's areas where hay and forest overlap. And so making a decision about what class you should be assigned to is problematic. There's really no good way to do it. Generally, it's just randomly assigned one or the other class. There are also areas where there's no definition, these like large areas that have no box around them. And in that case, you have a pixel whose class is undefined. And since your whole goal was to define all the classes, or define the class of every pixel, this is a problem. You have undefined pixels. Honestly, parallelepiped, nobody uses anymore, but it's the simplest approach. So I talk about it to sort of have an intro to more complex approaches. Next most complex approach is minimum distance to means. So what you're going to do is you're going to define for each class a mean point. So the centroid or center of mass of each one of those classes. And you can see in this particular image that a little plus sign has been put near the center of each class. So that's the mean urban condition, or the mean or condition or spectral condition, the mean sand position or spectral condition, etc., etc. And then if we have new pixels, like again 1 and 2, all we do is say, well, what is the class that has the most similar mean to that new pixel? So 1 is closest to the center pixel for corn, so that would be assigned corn. 2 is closest to sand, and therefore it would be assigned to sand. So you use the Euclidean distance, right, to determine the distance of each unknown pixel to each class mean. There are other distances. You should have studied this in GIS. You can use a city block distance or straight line method. But in general, it's the Euclidean distance that we use. It's a parametric decision rule because it's based on the statistical parameters of all the pixels that are in a training data sample. The advantages are that it's fast because it's mathematically simple, computationally efficient. It's reasonably accurate. All the pixels are assigned to a class. Even if you're in the middle of nowhere, there's some class that you're closest to. Although some algorithms allow you to say, if you're further than a particular distance away from the closest class mean, then don't provide a classification for that particular pixel. The disadvantages are that it's not sensitive to different amounts of variance in the training data sets. So if we look at point 2, right, point 2 is closest to the center point for sand, but it actually falls in an area where you've got urban pixels. So we have things that are very similar to point 2 that have been declared, using our knowledge of the field or using photos, to be urban. And so even though it's closer to sand, it's more likely to be urban. And that's the reason we come up with that conclusion is we haven't looked at the variability within the two classes. Sand points seem to very tightly cluster around that mean position, whereas urban points, and this is largely the case with real urban areas, they're a mix of different kinds of surfaces, so they tend to be highly variable. So there's a lot of variability in the urban class, and that is what makes point 2 more similar to urban, because that urban stretches out a long ways from the center point. So if you have an application where spectral classes are close to each other and the classes have some high variance, or you have classes with both low and high variance, then you're going to wind up not wanting to use minimum distance. The classifier that people have used for a very long time is the maximum likelihood classifier. And the maximum likelihood classifier creates probability density functions. So basically bell curves, right? Like I've shown here for class 1 and class 2. And that's what you use to determine the probability of an unknown pixel belonging to a particular training class. So you can imagine that you have a pixel with a spectral value anywhere along that line, that horizontal line where you have class 1 and class 2. If those points are, or that if that point is below one of the peaks of the two curves, if it's under the peak for class 1, then it's highly likely that it belongs to class 1. If it's in the portion of that curve that doesn't overlap with class 2, it's also highly probable that it belongs to class 1. Where you get into a question is when you have a point that falls where the two curves overlap. And so that means that there are spectral conditions where either class 1 or class 2 could be potential classes. And so what you do is you look at the which class has the higher probability, as illustrated by having the higher value on the red line that defines the probability. Okay, so the only place where you can't define that is where the two red lines intersect, and then you have equal probability for either class, and in that case, which is relatively infrequent, you have a random assignment of the pixel to either class 1 or class 2. We'll see what a ellipsoidal equal probability contour looks like, I think, in the next slide. So here we have the same classes again, and what you can imagine is that each one of those classes has associated with it a three-dimensional shape, okay? And that three-dimensional shape projected into the two-dimensional shape gives it the equal probability lines. So if you're near the center of, say, the urban class, that first equal probability or centermost equal probability line shows that there's a 90% chance that you belong to that class. And then as you go further out, the probability that you belong to that class is less and less. And you can see that, for instance, with urban and sand, the lines on the equal probability lines touch. Okay, so that's in the three-dimensional sense where the two probability bell shapes intersect. Another way to look at this is like this, okay? So here we have the shapes for the probability. The higher up you are, the higher the probability that you belong to one of these classes. So you can see sand has the highest probability. That's because all the probability is in one small area, okay? And so if you're in that small area, then you definitely belong to sand. Urban, on the other hand, you can see is a lower feature. And at some point, the urban feature and the sand feature interact. And that's where you have to make a rule about deciding whether or not you're urban or sand. The advantages of this approach, it's the most robust of the three we've looked at. It gives you the most accurate results. I mean, provided the training data is good, but that's always a question. And it takes the variability of classes into account by using the covariance matrix, how variable each one of the classes is in each one of the bands. The disadvantage is it tends to overclassify signatures or classes with relatively large values in the covariance matrix. Basically, highly variable classes tend to sort of swamp all the other classes. So urban, for instance, is a class where, in this case, it was very nicely defined. But because urban is a highly variable class by nature, if you sample it very well and take into account every possible kind of thing that you might call urban, then there's going to be a pretty good probability that almost anything in the image could belong to the urban class. And maximum likelihood makes that possible. Okay. The one other approach to classification rules I want to talk about is sorry, it's a long lecture, is the partition method or forest method. So decision tree classification has become a very important approach in quantitative analysis. It's a classification algorithm that uses the training data to develop a tree-like set of classification rules or decisions. Okay, and they've gained tremendous popularity for classifying remote sensing data due to the fact they're non-parametric. They don't require any statistical assumptions about, say, the normality of the underlying distribution of the spectral values. And they're very easy to use and interpret. So two statistical problems that you run into with data analysis in general is they're on the top left. Most statistical approaches assume fundamentally that the data is drawn from a normal distribution. Okay, you can see that when we were looking at the maximum likelihood approach. You're assuming that fundamentally the data was drawn normally and has this nice bell-shaped curve. Well, we already saw when we looked at univariate and multivariate statistical approaches in remote sensing that that's hardly ever the case. I mean, that's definitely the exception. Usually you have multimodal data. That is, you have different cover types that have different mean values for a particular band, and so you have clumps or modes of values for each one of those classes. So that's the two conditions on the top. On the bottom, most statistical approaches assume homoscedasticity. Homoscedasticity. I always screw that up. Meaning that the variability in one variable is the same relative to another variable. You can see how that is. As you go from small values to large values on the x-axis, the variability on the y-axis remains similar. However, most data sets have heteroscedasticity. Okay, that is, as values get larger, the more variable they become. And so you start out making these two assumptions about your data set that are probably not correct. And although you can fix this by using data transformations, the truth of the matter is, particularly in something like remote sensing, where you have lots of bands and you have lots of possible combinations of bands, it's very difficult to go in and properly assess for these conditions and correct for them for any reasonable data set. So decision tree classifiers develop classification of rules by recursively partitioning the training data into homogeneous groups. So here we have three groups: red, green, and blue. Blue is water. Red is forest, and green is soil. Okay, and we're plotting them in a feature space, band 4 versus band 2. And the first thing that a tree classifier is going to do is it's going to look for a simple rule that is going to separate out one or more of the classes from each other. And it can immediately find one. This first classification rule simply says, if band 2 is less than 0.1, then those are water pixels. Easy enough. And you can see that that classification rule then enters in at the top of our classification tree. So here we have a question: is band 2 less than 0.1? If it is, then it's water. If it's not, then it goes to the rest of the data. This is all within the upper left-hand graph. So now all we have left to look at are forest points and soil points. And again, we need a rule. And again, we have a simple rule here. We can say, if band 4 is greater than 0.3, then it's a forest. If band 4 is less than 0.3, it's a soil. Okay? And going back to the upper left-hand figure again, under the rest of the data, we have our rule there, band 4 greater than 0.3, and then if it's yes, it's a forest. If it's no, then it's a soil. Okay? And those final determinations are in the tree structure known as terminal nodes. So that's where your classification comes out. And the advantage about this is that we're not really looking at the variability in a particular class per se, but that variability is still going to be incorporated in where the thresholds are put for each individual rule. So you start with an image, you just take the individual bands and generate training data, or take the training data and the rules that were generated, follow the rules for each one to get at each one of the final nodes. So you wind up with an area of water, an area of forest, and an area of soil. Straightforward. Okay, finally, I'm going to get to garbage in, garbage out, which is an expression you may be familiar with, or developing training sets for supervised classification. So these are sort of the rules of thumb that you need to be thinking about when you think about doing supervised classification. Like I said, a lot of your success with doing supervised classification is just going to be based on how much experience you have. And so this few slides are just there to try to give you some of that background that I've picked up. So we talked about this before. What's a representative sample of a particular land cover class? We're going to be generating these training data sets. Each individual piece of training data is going to be a polygon with a label. Do you want those polygons to be spectrally pure? That is, do you want to look for areas that have no variability in them? Or do you want to have polygons that have variability in them? Because the various cover types to be classified are, in fact, spectrally variable, right? There's no spectra for forest per se. The spectral value for a forest, the average spectral value for a forest, is made up of the spectral values for the kinds of tree that's there, the kind of whether the trees are sunlit or shadowed. That's both at the landscape scale, but it's also, within forests, you get shadowing of one tree by another. So you're going to have brightly lit foliage, darkly lit foliage. You can have soil if there's soil exposed. You're going to have needles or dead leaves of various types, and you're going to have understory vegetation. Each one of those has a spectral signature of its own, but the forest itself, that's fundamentally just an average of the individual spectral signatures. So you need to know land cover class, and you then delineate polygon. You can delineate the polygons of the associated areas manually. In Imagine, it's called an AOI, an area of interest. In Envy, it's called an ROI, a region of interest. And in ArcGIS, I think they just call them polygons. They don't give them a special name. So you can delineate them manually that way. You can also use the seed procedure in Imagine, and I believe in ArcGIS. And basically what that allows you to do is click on an area and select a threshold that allows you to only get pixels that are similar enough to the place that you clicked that they fit within the threshold. That's often a very good way to do things because, again, drawing polygons manually, it's very much possible to draw over areas that are not actually of the cover type that you're interested in. Using a GIS database is a tempting idea. There are thousands, tens of thousands, I guess hundreds of thousands for some government collected field plot networks to use as a training data set. And if you have availability to them, which is a problem we'll talk about, that doesn't require, you don't have to spend time or money or the boredom of actually collecting signatures. Generally a bad idea. So first of all, often these plots only have point locations associated with them, not polygons. So if you just want to generalize the point to a polygon, so for instance, if you have the agency's plot layout, which might consist of, several circular areas that that data will be collected in for a particular plot type. If you just generalize your point to that polygon in a simple way, you're often going to have features in there that are spectrally quite different, like road or water. So that's going to increase your class spectral variability. And so as a consequence, because the variability gets increased, using classification techniques such as the maximum likelihood approach, that class may wind up incorporating a lot of spectrally very different areas into the particular class. Agency classifications are not always compatible with remote sensing. So generally they're more complex than remotely sensed data can handle. So you might have a lot of different species classifications that you simply can't observe those differences with remote sensing. All of these agencies do their best, but the field classification accuracy and the data management are not always optimal. It's a big job. It's a big job. For instance, the forest inventory and analysis program at the Forest Service. It's an enormous undertaking to collect all that data, and so it's just there are errors that you can avoid if you're just doing a much smaller number of points. And the point locations are not always that accurate. And when they're accurate, that is the GPS points for the center of the plots, and they're not always available to the general public. So forest inventory and analysis plots, you have to be FIA, forest inventory and analysis, personnel in order to get direct access to those locations. Some rules of thumb on adequate sampling. The minimum number of pixels in each of your training data samples should be about 10 times the number of bands. And that's because as the number of bands increases, the amount of uncertainty in a single band has to decrease to lead to the same overall uncertainty. You need at least 3 to 10 polygons for each spectral class, and 3 would be for something like water that's easy to distinguish, if in fact in your data set you don't have a lot of deep, dark, shadowed forest, and water is easy to distinguish. Yeah, you're going to need at least 3 for that class, but you're probably going to need 10 and possibly 20 or more polygons for each spectral class. And it's important to capture the variability of each cover type. So you can't simply sample very similar corn polygons and hope to get all of the corn in that's in your scene in that particular class. Some of that corn may be unusual looking corn, but there may be a lot of quote unquote unusual looking corn that you have to capture. You need to think about how many spectral classes you're going to need for each information class. So for instance, if you do have, if perhaps you had maybe you have irrigated corn and you have non-irrigated corn, and the non-irrigated corn is going to have less green area. It may not be as vibrantly green. So you might be having to think about having a separate spectral subclass for non-irrigated corn and irrigated corn. This is why you very often want to do a pre-classification analysis. And that pre-classification analysis would be an unsupervised classification, probably with a reasonably large number of classes, so that you can see, you can ask yourself, okay, what classes are naturally dropping out? Because if certain classes are naturally dropping out of an unsupervised classification analysis, then it's likely you're going to have to take account of them when you're doing your supervised classification. Training statistics. So as you're doing your training, one thing you can look at is histograms for individual polygons, okay? Or for all the polygons in a particular spectral class to make sure that it's got a reasonably smooth, preferably Gaussian distribution. Okay, so for instance, if you did a histogram of all of the data values, spectral values for a given band for a particular polygon, and you found that there were some outlier values, like most of the values were between 100, well, let's say 0.3 reflectance and 0.35 reflectance, and then there were a couple that were 0.7, you probably want to get rid of the pixels that are 0.7 because they're just too unlike the original ones to be used meaningfully in a supervised classification context. And then once you've gotten all of the training samples you've got together for a particular class, again, doing a set of histograms is a good idea because, again, you might have a particular polygon that is very much unlike the other polygons in that class. And there are ways to get these histogram things done within the popular software packages. A contingency matrix, you can actually do a classification for the training data and make sure that your classification algorithm is actually correctly classifying just your training data. So if you find that, oh wait, lots of my oats are being classified as corn, if that's happening at the training level data, then that's a problem. And it's just going to get, it's just going to follow through. So you're going to have to go back to your data and figure out what spectral classes are causing the problem. You might have to redefine what spectral classes you're going to produce. Note, we use contingency matrices when we do accuracy assessment. We'll talk about them in gripping detail. However, we don't use the training data, okay, when we do the accuracy assessment. We use a separate set of testing data that we'll talk about. So you shouldn't confuse using a contingency matrix with your training data with your actual accuracy assessment, which needs to have a separate source of testing data. You have a question of lumpers and splitters. So how many spectral classes can you actually deal with? Should you lump spectrally similar classes together and have fewer spectral subclasses, or should you keep them separate, have them split? Some people tend to lump different conditions together. Some people tend to split them. What is important to be aware of is for mixed edge spectral classes, and you'll want to get rid of these. Sometimes you have, back to the example of a forest and with a road adjacent to it, in something like Landsat where you have large pixels, you're going to have pixels that mix those two conditions, and that's a problem because those pixels don't look like anything in the actual scene. They're only good there because they're the mix. So you have to be very careful about any edges in the data set that you use to make your spectral classes. You also want to make sure that you don't want to merge too many spectral classes that are somewhat similar together, or you can wind up with a very broad spectral class and have your whole image classified as that particular class. A lot of that material I just gave you borders on the contradictory, and it seems that way because it's a question of finding the right balance between putting a lot of things, lumping, splitting, and it's just something that comes with experience. Some other limitations of classification, in this case, supervised classification, you have to have good knowledge of the area and the identification of cover types at known locations. Your knowledge of the scene and what's going on in it is more important than any algorithm and no algorithm is going to save you from having to know the details of what's going on in a scene, or at least knowing someone who does. Other limitation of classification is you as the analyst may not know enough about the interactions between your information categories of interest and their spectral variability, and therefore you're not going to be able to obtain a good representative sample of all the important spectral classes present. And again, these are concerns that tend to go away with experience.